Can you hear me now?
Yeah!
Your PS3 is overheating! You need to fix it!
Okay! In this video, I'm going to show you what tools and techniques will allow you to safely delid your PS3 and fix overheating issues. I'll discuss some of the issues you can encounter and show you my technique. There are certainly more ways to accomplish it, but these are mine. First thing you need to do is figure out if your PS3 is actually overheating. If it acts like the console in the intro, the answer is pretty obvious. But it's not always as straightforward. The reason is because as the console ages, the contacts between the heatsink and the processor deteriorates. Thermal paste wears out. Most people already know about this, and the do-it-yourselfers out there are no strangers to opening the console to replace it with high-quality paste. In fact, that's probably the first thing you should check. Disassemble and clean out the dust bunnies, replace the paste on the heatsinks. Make it nice and clean again. That's pretty easy, and you don't really need a tutorial to help you figure that out. Go find a teardown of your model and go from there. But that's just one of the two places where paste can wear out. The other is under the integrated heat spreader, IHS for short. It's actually more critical that the paste between the die and IHS is good, because that's where the heat is generated. If it can't transfer this heat away efficiently, it backs up and overheats very quickly. And since the IHS is glued on, changing this is harder. If this is the point you stopped at, afraid you'll break it if you continue, then your instincts are correct. Removing the IHS, deliding as it's called, is tricky. If you don't do it right, you can destroy your PS3. First, we need to determine which processor is overheating, CPU or the GPU. Before I tell you the correct way to figure out which it is, I'm just going to predict it's the CPU. It usually is, like 95 out of 100 times. The CPU is the hotter of the two chips in most consoles, and its paste tends to wear out first. But to be sure, you can use the following clues. If your fans are loud but it's not shutting down automatically, chances are it's not bad enough to register a Silicone error in the log, but you can check your Silicone error logs using ps3toolset.com anyway, just in case. If you see errors ending in 1200, that means the CPU overheated. If it's 1201, it was the GPU. But if you don't see any overheating related errors there, you'll need to be able to run Homebrew to see system temps. You can jailbreak or use Homebrew Enabler, but I'm not going to cover that in this tutorial. You can easily find videos to learn how. Once you're jailbroken or running Hen, you can install Webman mod to monitor CPU and GPU temps and easily figure out which one of them is causing it. For example, this console required 78% fan speeds in order to maintain 67 degrees Celsius on the CPU. If you look at the RSX temperature, it's 51. So what's happening here is the CPU is quite inefficient, but the RSX paste is good and efficient and it's wicking away the heat. But what's driving the dynamic fan speed is the CPU. If your console isn't stable enough to jailbreak, it just shuts off before you can, then you'll have to use the Silicone UART diagnostics. I made a tutorial for that if you want to learn how, link in the description. But it requires soldering a couple of wires and using a script to retrieve them. If that's beyond your ability, you probably shouldn't be considering deliding it yourself, and this is the time to look for a professional repair service instead. Okay, let's say you determined it's your CPU that's overheating, and a repaste didn't help. You need a delid. Here's a short synopsis of what we'll cover. We'll use a proper CPU deliding tool to remove the IHS, clean the old silicone off the interposer and IHS, print, sand, and make sure the cell brace is 1 millimeter thick. Use it and the backplate to help keep the motherboard flat while you glue the IHS back on with a clamp directly over the center of the die. Alright, step 1. When we delid, it places force on the board that can flex, bend, and break the solder balls. So before attempting to delid, either the CPU or GPU, screw the motherboard into a brace that keeps it flat. This is a reballing jig that prevents warping, but it's great for this too. You'll see several people using it while deliding. It's just to protect solder joints from warping stresses deliding places on the board and increase the chance of success. The IHS on the CPU is glued on using a bead of silicone around the edge, but there's a gap on the side facing the filter. To delid it, we need something thin and stiff enough to get underneath. There are several tools people have used successfully, but all of them have traps for new players. The most important thing is to be sure your tool cannot dig into the substrate and cut the traces on the interposer. Here you can see me using a deliding tool I made to cut all the way around the CPU. It only took about an hour of sanding and grinding to make it. This is the best possible tool, and I recommend you make one, because once you have it, the CPU delid will be easy. But lots of people prefer a painter's number 2 palette knife instead. The main issue with this tool is that the lower edge is sharp enough it can gouge into the substrate and scratch traces, especially when navigating around nearby surface mount devices because you have to lift it over them, which bends the metal. It's also easy to slip and knock one of them off, but I know several techs that have learned to use one successfully. No matter what tool you use, you need to make sure the lower edge is sanded smooth and blunt. You want the shape of the blade to force the tip up against the IHS as it cuts, riding on a cushion of silicone. If you don't do this, it can dig in and cut traces. These traces are very, very tiny, and repairing them is extremely difficult microsoldering, and you can't just replace the CPU on a PS3. It's married to the Silicone and flash. The only way to replace it is to replace the entire married set from a donor board, which itself is usually easier to fix. It's just not worth it. Please don't be lazy. Spend the time it takes to prepare your tool. Then practice deliding on a dead console before you try it for real. If you nick a CPU trace here, it's done. You can always delid and reglue it back on multiple times until you have the process down. Watch videos of people doing it successfully and unsuccessfully so that you can see what does and doesn't work. But to give you a short list of what not to do not use a razor blade. Not only is it difficult to find a blade thin enough to work, getting the angle you need is basically impossible without bending it, which can gouge into the substrate. And because it's hardened steel, it can shatter and send razor-sharp metal springing off towards your eyes. Do not use cutting wire or dental floss. They cut equally into the silicone and substrate. I've seen people use dental floss, which literally sanded away the traces. I've seen cutting wire do the same. It's one of those things that sounds good in theory, but in practice is both tedious and dangerous. It also digs into your fingers and takes forever. Do not start at the corners. That's where the traces are. It's hard to get the blade started, and when you start the cut, you have to rest the metal against the substrate. You don't want there to be traces where you start the cut because you're likely going to scuff the substrate, getting it under the lip and riding on the silicone. It takes a bit of wiggling and extra pressure to get it started. That's why I added a bit of oil or grease. It helps get it started without needing to heat the IHS or apply too much pressure. The opening in the silicone is in a place without traces, so it's where you want to start the cut. And that's why I don't like the number 2 painter's knife. It's hard to get the right angle to get in that gap, but others swear by it, so the choice is yours. Now that you have the IHS off, you need to make a choice. Do you want to reglue the IHS or not? I know what you're thinking. Why would I go through such trouble to delid just to glue it back on? What if I need to repaste? Or if I want to try another brand? Well, if you replace with crap paste, then yes, it would be annoying to have to delid again in a year or two when it fails. Don't. Replace it with a high-quality, long-lasting paste like Arctic MX4 or ceramic, and you won't need to reapply again for at least 8 to 10 years. Whatever Sony used lasts this long, so if that time comes, just delid it again. Now that you have the proper tool, it's easy. I mean, it's your console and you can do whatever you want with it. If you want to run it over with a car, light it on fire, or use it as a doorstop, that's your right. But a lot of people will see this video and be influenced by it, so I would never want to recommend people take unnecessary risks that can harm their console. I put up a disclaimer before I do something I don't recommend, what I call technomancy. I have a responsibility to recommend the most proper and safe method I can, which is why I recommend putting it back on. Now, I know some of you are still performing mental gymnastics, rationalizing why you don't need to glue the IHS back on. I've heard it all before and had these arguments plenty of times. I had a whole section laying out how the arguments usually go, but I decided to delete it. I don't need to drag everyone watching through all that drama. Instead, I'll just lay out the facts. An IHS has two main objectives. The first is in the name, to spread the heat away from the hot spots on the die for efficient cooling. Most people know that. But the second is less obvious, to stiffen the package.
Oh my god, look at my package.
Not that kind. The processor package refers to the way the chip is sandwiched together. The materials are carefully chosen to meet design goals. Packaging and thermal design engineers use computer-aided engineering software to model and simulate how heat and expansion stresses affect the mean time before failure for a processor. Extensive testing and modeling is necessary to balance these factors in the final integrated design. The choice to use an IHS stiffener window or direct die contact with or without a stiffener is not just to meet thermal design goals, but also to meet mechanical endurance as well. How many thermal cycles it can take before it breaks the solder joints, for example. In the end, IBM, Toshiba, and Sony's engineers decided an IHS should be glued on. And as a great person once said, I'm dumb, Sony is smart. So we have a dilemma and choice to make. I have no way to prove it's bad, and I have no way to prove it's fine. Since I can't prove either outcome is better, it's the safer recommendation to just glue it back on. That way I'm not telling you to change a variable that might harm the console. I don't have the expertise or simulation data to make that determination, but the engineers who made the chip did, and that's enough for me. So my recommendation for you is that if the chip had an IHS that was glued on, use appropriate adhesives to return it the way you found it. Now, I don't always do it on my personal consoles, but I would if I were selling it to a customer, unless specifically asked not to. It's a bunch of extra work, but it restores the console back to stock. However, the process can be done wrong and cause issues, so here's how to reglue it properly. Use a plastic razor blade to remove the silicone on the interposer. You need to do this because the silicone doesn't stick well to cured silicone. I'm using one of those lever things you often find in phone repair kits. You can also use your fingernail. It's not hard enough to scratch the solder resist, making it perfect for this sort of thing. To get the silicone off the IHS, you can use a regular steel razor blade. There's no traces here that you have to worry about, so it's not a big deal. But of course, you need to use sharp safety. Adult supervision is required. I used a bit of caulking remover to help remove more of it, but to be honest, I don't think it works very well and might need to sit for hours to really penetrate. I got as much of it off as I could, but you'll never get it all off. Then you need to clean the surface really well with isopropyl alcohol so the silicone has a good surface to stick to. Step 3. Okay, I need to introduce you to the cell bracer. When you sent your console into Sony for a refurbishment, they sometimes installed a little plastic brace underneath the CPU backplate. It does not add pressure under the dot. Let me get that out of the way right now. That's what the eraser mod and thermal pads do, which I've seen crack the die in half and cause an irreparable yellow light of death. All this does is resist bowing under the die, which is especially important while we reglue because once we release the clamping force, the motherboard will want to spring back and cause pent-up strain to be locked in by the glue. That's bad. To prevent that, I install a 3D printed clone I made to help brace the motherboard and keep it flat under the die while the silicone cures. The purpose of the cell bracer is to bridge the gap between the four standoffs, being the exact same height or slightly less. It maintains flatness, preventing the motherboard from bending underneath the die. When the bracer is made correctly, it only restores flatness. That's it. And that's why it's so important to be sure it measures 1 millimeter. The 3D printer can cause blobs or irregularities that need to be sanded down and measured with calipers. Otherwise, it could add pressure and be just as bad as the eraser mod. I didn't make this model for people to abuse and harm their console, so be sure it's sanded down to 1 millimeter or slightly less, and it needs to be printed in ABS, PETG, or nylon so it can endure the heat without deforming. You can't use PLA. After I printed it, I used a wet sanding stone to remove material around the lip so that it's exactly 1 millimeter thick.
Alright, so with these things,
very important that you sand them down so they're exactly 1 millimeter. Otherwise, you're adding pressure, and this is exactly the same as the eraser mod, which will kill your consoles. I have got to prepare these. These ones are fresh off the printer, so I haven't prepared them yet. I understand the desire to just print these and throw them on. They're pretty close, and maybe your printer is like really good and it can get it just perfect. That'd be awesome, but I really doubt it. I printed like 10 or 15 of these, and I dread having to do this process because it's tedious, but it's necessary. And I have decided I'm going to start putting these on whenever I delid and I re-glue, because when you're clamping it, I don't want the center of the die, when there's no glue, to be pressing down and bowing underneath the posts. So this is just going to brace it so that it's flat when I clamp it down. So I feel like that's the most vulnerable time for the cell, is when you're gluing it back on, because the backplate is not covering the center underneath the die. It's just the 4 corners around the outside of the interposer underneath the motherboard. All right, so it has that edge rested against the side of the jaws, and then you close it. So you're measuring the whole lip all the way along the jaws. So if any part of it along that entire side is higher, it will get it. Because if you measure it like this, then anywhere along here could be lower or higher. So you got to measure it along that way. Okay, that's pretty good. 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 Okay, so that cell bracer is ready. Okay, and this is what you've got to go through every time you print these to make them not harm your console. If you don't do that and you use these, you are playing Russian roulette, and I will not be held responsible for giving you the 3D models to destroy your console without that disclaimer and that warning. Sand these things down and double check with your micrometer and make sure that you are not adding pressure. Otherwise, well, you deserve whatever happens to your console. That's how that works. You can see me double checking its thickness here compared with the height of the standoffs. Mine was 0.04 millimeters thinner, so it can't add pressure. That's fine. The one I designed here only fits on backwards compatible models with the 90 nanometer CPU, but my buddy Shiro made a clone of one he found on a Sony refurbed 65 nanometer model. That works for the rest of the fat models. Slims have a 45 nanometer CPU, and my buddy Samsonite made a version that works with most of them. There are some later Super Slims that it doesn't fit on, but who cares about them anyway? Links to the STL files are in the description. Now the backplate goes on. I've drilled out the rivets holding them onto the RF shield so that I can use these on my test bench.
This is the future.
That way I can probe stuff without it getting in the way, but you don't need to. You can just line the motherboard up.
Evolution.
I taped both the backplate and the bracer so that they don't move when I flip the board.
This is the future. Evolution.
In order to glue the IHS back on, you need to use the right stuff. You can't just use super glue. And yes, I've seen people try. My buddy Squeeped has been using RTD gasket maker high temperature silicone successfully for years. This high torque Permatex stuff is a very close match in stiffness and color to what Sony used. It's perfect. But you only need a tiny amount. I don't want to waste the tube, so I bought some 3 milliliter Luer Lock syringes and Luer Lock tips. I fill these up with silicone and squeeze a bit extra into the tip, so when I open it, the tip won't be clogged with half-cured silicone. Silicone cures in the presence of oxygen, taking about 24 hours when exposed to air, but it will penetrate just about anything given enough time. The aluminum tube it came in is an excellent oxygen barrier.
This is the future.
Which is why they used it to package the product. But the syringes and lure lock work really well too. Then I vacuum sealed them with a blunt tip needle, that way they'll be ready whenever I need one. I laid a bead of silicone down around the peripheral of the interposer where the old silicone was. You can also do it to the rim of the IHS. Either works.
This is the future.
I actually didn't use enough,
Human error.
but it is important to leave that gap, otherwise you'll trap a pocket of air which will expand and contract with heat. We don't want that. I did this console using the same syringe of silicone about 3 months later, and it was still uncured in the tube. I'd guess this one 3ml syringe would last 5 Delids and about 6 months. That one tube of Permatex should last me years. Now I'm leaving that gap, because that's really important. Okay, take that off, and cap back on, push a little into the tube, and cinch it back down. And then that should be good for the next time I need to use it. I mean, it's been in there for months, and it's still good, which is almost surprising. Tried and tested. I like it. I know it works for at least 8 to 10 years. I've used it personally for that long. I know some people say it's not the best paste, but you don't need the best paste. You just need really good, long-lasting stuff. And MX4 fits the bill for me. That's all you need. Okay, now the IHS goes right back on. Clamps, they're good and strong, and this is why I put that back plate on there, because I need to reach down in there right over the center of that die, and that's going to keep it flat while this cures. It's going to be right on the bottom of that back plate, and I want that pressure right over the center of that die. And as you can see, the silicone is squishing out a little bit. I don't like how much it's squishing out. It means I might have used a little bit too much, but it's enough, which is fine. And it's better to have it squirting out the sides a little bit than to not be squirting out at all. The surfaces are slowly getting closer together. You need that constant pressure, and the silicone is going to cure in oxygen. So that takes 24 hours to fully cure. And I want it to stay in this position. I don't want it to move. I want the pressure to be directly over the center of the die so that the IHS can rock into position flat against that die. I don't want it to be the pressure to be over here and then to rock like that, and then you end up with a gap like this. Instead of it being flat together, you have a gap, and then that doesn't work well. And then tomorrow I can assemble, and I should not have any more issues with the CPU overheating. I'm just inspecting my work here. This is the one I did 3 months ago with the smaller bead. which did work fine, and the IHS isn't going anywhere, but I didn't use as much as I should have. I experimented with liquid metal with this console, and am expecting to have to reapply eventually when it soaks into the nickel plating, so I'm not too worried about the silicone being a bit thin. Nickel plating limits the amount gallium in liquid metal can penetrate and amalgamate with the copper in the IHS, so it shouldn't soak in too much. If I applied enough to begin with, I may not need to reapply. That's why I used those open cell weather stripping foam barriers to contain the excess like Sony did on the PS5. This is to test to see if I could safely and successfully replace the thermal paste with liquid metal without needing to delid again and reapply. But it's only been 3 months and this is a long-term test, so I'll update you with the results of that in a future video. Okay, but what if your GPU is overheating? Or maybe it's not overheating yet, but it's running hotter than you think it should be. Or maybe you have a 90nm model and it's struggling to keep under the recommended 68 degrees Celsius to hopefully stave off a bump defect. Or maybe you simply want to delid it to prevent issues in the future. Well, first let me caution you. 90nm and 65nm GPUs have a different thermal adhesive that softens when heat is applied, and it's easier to pop off using the lever method you're probably already aware of. But the 40nm RSX uses a much stiffer one that requires much more force. I have successfully used this method to delid it several times, and every time it scares me. I think it's going to break the BGA or destroy the VRAM, which can happen, but thankfully it hasn't yet to me. So, while I'd like to show you a safe method of removing the RSX lid, there really isn't a convenient way. The safest way is to desolder the entire RSX from the board and then rock a razor blade back and forth until it cuts through and pops one VRAM module at a time. But that's really only feasible during a GPU replacement, not accessible to the average Joe. You can do the same thing on board, but it's difficult to get the right angle, so you know you're cutting against the IHS, not into the side of the VRAM itself, which would destroy it. But it can be done that way, and some people recommend it as a safer method. I don't really like any of the methods to delid on board, but I guess I prefer the popping method, mainly because I only work on fat models with softer adhesives. Disclaimer: this is a preference and not something I recommend. Be sure your RSX needs delided before attempting any method. It can kill your console, so it's not worth the risk unless it's gonna die if you don't.
So what I like to do is add a little bit of pressure and just keep holding it until it, I need to work it in a little bit further though.
My advice is not to do it if you're just trying to make it a couple of degrees cooler using a better quality paste. It shouldn't be considered a performance hack or preventative maintenance. The only case where it might make sense is with a 90nm RSX that has underfill that softens at 70 degrees Celsius. And if you're having a hard time keeping temps below that using webman mod or custom Syscon fan tables, it might be time to delid.
And it's loose.
Luckily, the adhesive they use softens enough at 100 degrees Celsius to easily pop off using the lever method.
No damage. It was a little hairy. I usually can do it a little bit cleaner than that when I'm not fussing with the camera being in the way. But it's off. No harm, no foul.
Myself and others have successfully done this many times, but that doesn't mean it can't cause the VRAM to delaminate or BGA to crack, etc. So prepare yourself for that possibility if you decide to do it. Once you have the IHS off, you can use a razor blade to remove the thermal adhesive from the VRAM and IHS. Then isopropyl alcohol to clean the surfaces. Now use the backplate and RSX bracer to keep the motherboard flat under the die.
This is the RSX bracer, and it has to be filed down to exactly 1 millimeter at all the high points. So I am double checking that I'm filing it down so I don't add pressure. I don't know if you guys have seen this yet. I've only posted it a few times. But yeah, this just fits behind the RSX and it braces in between all of the SMDs, all the caps. It's basically the same as the cell bracer, but for the RSX. So when I delid and I reglue, I use these Woolcroft clamps that have a pretty good spring tension. I think it's enough that it would bend the board underneath. the die. And so when I release this afterwards, it's going to want to spring back. And so now you've got pent up strain locked into the interposer in the VGA area. And I worry that that might have a long-term reliability effect. So when I reglue, I put these underneath the back plates. So it'll be like that, bracing underneath the board everywhere, so that when it's gluing, it's kept coplanar, completely flat, like it would have been at the assembly. So if this is flat, right, that's your IHS, and this is your die. You want them to be flat. You don't want there to be a gap in your paste. If the pressure that's down on the die, it's coming in from this angle, causes the die to bend just a little bit, well, now your paste has a gap. And that's what this does. That's why Sony used them, is it just braces the back of the board to keep it flat. So if it was like that before, now it's like this, and it restores contact with the paste that's already there, and it saves them the trouble of having to delid your console. Customers happy they get it back until it dies in 3 months when the paste finally does wear out. And like, hey, but Sony's like, 3-month warranty, sorry, send it back in. Yeah, they don't delid, so it does work, but it's cheating, and all it's doing is restoring it temporarily. The only issue I have with it is that I think people are buying them and using them, installing them without sanding them down. And if you do that, you're basically doing an eraser mod, and you can destroy your console. These have a utility, and they can be used responsibly. They can also be abused like any tool. I'm not a part of that, but I don't control what scammers do, so.
Be sure to clean off the old paste and apply new high-quality paste such as Arctic MX4 or Ceramic 2. The latter doesn't have that high a thermal conductivity, but it's more than good enough and will last a very, very long time. As for the thermoplaster, I recommend replacing it with Stars 922. It's inexpensive, cures nice and stiff, and will pop off easily with heat if you ever need to delid again. Place a blob on all 4 VRAM and replace the IHS. Use the clamp centered over the die to be sure the IHS cures flat against it, just like the CPU, and allow it to cure overnight before assembling. I'm not going to go too in-depth on assembly, but I should mention that you want to make sure to use the right thickness thermal pads. On the backwards compatible models, there are 2 sizes, 1.5mm that go on the VRM and EEGS, and 2mm pads that go on the Southbridge and Blu-ray drive. I've seen people try to use thicker pads on the VRM, like 2mm pads, but when you do this, it adds thickness to the RF shield and can prevent the heat sink from sitting flat against the IHS, causing poor cooling and overheating. So you want to make sure you use the right size pads. Measure the thickness of your original pads, choose a replacement with new high quality pads if needed. Here's the thing. Sony used good pads. Many of the cheap silicone pads you see online actually have a lower thermal conductivity, so you want something with at least 6 watts per meter Kelvin. You can find higher though, and if you want to try them out, feel free to experiment. It's your console. If the ones Sony used are still soft and malleable, they can be reused. Just clean off the grime and put them back. You can tell they need to be replaced if they're dried out, cracked, or crumbling. What about the fans? Well, I've tested the 19-blade BG1402 fan versus the 15-blade D14F on the backwards compatible models, and they were actually about the same. The 19-blade fan can push more air than the 15-blade can thanks to its more powerful motor, but the fan noise in decibels is roughly equivalent at normal fan speeds. The reason is that the fan blades, bearings, and motor whine is barely audible compared to the air turbulence passing through and out of the console. Let's say it takes 300 cubic feet per minute to maintain 68 degrees Celsius in a stressful game. Maybe the 19-blade fan can push 300 CFM at 33%, but the 15-blade does it at 35%. 300 CFM is the same decibels regardless of the fan percentage needed to push it. The one thing I will say is that there's a different pitch. So some people might like the sound of one better versus the other, even though it's not louder. To my ear, the 19 blade is less annoying, but in terms of decibels, they are the same. You'll never need the fan to crank to 100% unless the console needs a delid and is about to overheat anyway. So the few extra CFM the 19 blade fan can theoretically push is completely pointless. Either fan is perfectly fine, so don't waste your money buying a 19 blade fan if you have the 15. And that's it. Unless the stress from disassembly, cleaning, delidding, and assembling caused a solder joint to crack, or you accidentally nicked a trace, you should be good to go for as long as it takes for the next thing to break. Mod busting time. What's the best power supply? And can using the APS 231 from a G model help lower temps in a backwards compatible unit? The answer is a definitive no. I tested that. You might think it would, since it's more efficient at about 80% compared to the ZSSR's 66%. And it's lower power at 285 watts compared to 399 watts. But you're forgetting that power supplies have a sweet spot efficiency at about 50 to 60% of their rating. This is why you want to get a power supply that can deliver about double the amount of power you need. Because if you need 400 watts and use a 400 watt power supply, it won't perform at peak efficiency. A backwards compatible PS3 can draw about 200 watts under load, which is 50% of the ZSSR's max rating. It'll perform with the sweet spot 66% efficiency at that load. Same with the APS 226. But the APS 231 wasn't intended for this model. It would be operating at about 70% of its rating, and now that makes it less efficient. How much less? I don't know. But to answer this question, I placed a thermocouple inside each power supply on the heatsink where the VRM are dissipating heat. Then I compared them. The change in temperature, or delta T, tells the story. Not only is the APS 231 the worst of the three, but there was also no significant difference in fan percentage between all three power supplies. Which means that even though the APS 226 is the most efficient at 83% and runs about 3C cooler, that doesn't affect temps enough to change the fan percentage or make the console quieter. Which makes sense. The PSU runs about 10C cooler than the RSX and CPU, which are what produce most of the heat. Yes, there is some heat loss due to the power supply's inefficiency, and it makes sense to think it could cause the console temps to increase. I haven't tested externalizing the PSU, but I doubt it would reduce temps enough to justify the hassle. The XMB idle test shows you why drilling holes in the console is a bad idea. At idle, the console isn't working as hard, so the fan speed decreases and the PSU temps actually increase. That's because the fan is sucking less air through the power supply, so it actually runs cooler when stressing. But when you drill holes, it circumvents the intended airflow pattern, and now the PSU can overheat and die sooner. Okay, fine. Just put a fan on it, right? Wrong. The entire motherboard is cooled by air passing over it and the RF shield. The VRMs get hotter, and so does the Blu-ray drive IC. So even if you add a fan over the PSU, those components will run hotter and die sooner. There are countless other ICs I haven't tested, and each one of them will also get less airflow. You can see the GPU and CPU temps are great when you drill holes, but what you don't see are the unintended consequences until it kills your console. So yeah, the APS 226 is the best power supply you can get. The APS 231 runs hotter, and it actually has a lower wattage value, which isn't a good idea to put in a backwards compatible unit anyway. And definitely don't drill holes. Stay away from these bad mods.
Work.
Alright, to sum this all up, I'm going to answer a few questions I get a lot in the comments. Should you worry about your PS3, especially if it's a launch model? No. As long as you blow out the dust bunnies and keep it in a well-ventilated place, I think you can be reasonably assured it's fine. If it's lasted this long, chances are it's a good egg, but you should still keep an eye on temps and make sure the paste is okay. If it's a fat model with a defective 90nm RSX, install Webman mod and keep it under 68 degrees Celsius. If you need more than 40 to 50% fan to do that, then it's probably time for a deep cleaning or a delid. Other model fats with the 65nm GPU and slims with the 40nm often have different heat sinks and fans, so I can't give you a concrete temperature for what's normal. Just start watching your temps and you'll get a feel for what it should be and be able to recognize when something's wrong. Delidding can cause irreparable damage, so it's important to only do it when it's absolutely needed and after practicing with appropriate tools and techniques. Watch videos, and after you've summoned the courage, try it on a dead board to test your choice in method. Or if it's beyond your comfort level, seek help from a professional that knows what they're doing and backs it up with a warranty. If you have a backwards compatible PS3 and are afraid it'll die, let me reassure you. The yellow light of death is not as big of a concern among 90nm GPUs as the red ring of death was in early Xbox 360s. Something like 95% of those launch model 360s have met their demise already, but in PS3 I'd estimate it's maybe 40%. That's just a feeling, and I don't really have any idea what the actual relative percentages are. I just know among broken PS3s with the 90nm GPU, it's the leading cause of death. That doesn't mean a working console that's well maintained is unreliable and will die from this vulnerability. The console could last a good long time without the defect being exploited. As long as you know there's a thermal related defect and take steps to mitigate it, you should be able to forestall the inevitable as long as possible. I'm not saying you can prevent it. I have no data to suggest that lower temps prevent the yellow light of death. I just know it theoretically could help, and it's best practice to take care of your stuff. In the meantime, enjoy it. These things will die eventually, be it a defective GPU, failed capacitor, corrupt flash chip, or whatever. The goal is to do what you can to make it last long enough for you to feel like it was worth it. As long as you get your money's worth, it'll have served its purpose, and you can look back on the fond memories you had with it, instead of feeling bitter that your time was cut short. If you had your PS3 overheat, what methods did you try? What didn't work for you? I'm kind of interested to hear what you have to say. Let me know in the comments. If you like this video, then you might like one of these. And as always, thank you so much. The support from the community has been amazing. Seriously, you guys rock. And until next time, don't fear the potato.